Hello and welcome to this Blender tutorial on fire simulations. We'll look at how to simulate fire and smoke. We'll design a scene in which an asteroid collides with the ground and explodes. You can find the link to the complete course in the description. It was produced by other colleagues in our team. Here, I want to give you an overview of the entire workflow without going into too much detail for each step. First of all, I want to show how to create a basic simulation. Create a new Blender file and insert a new object, such as a cylinder, to serve as our fire emitter. Insert a cube now. We'll use this object as our simulation domain. To fill the space where the simulation should take place, we must position and scale the cube. Now, navigate to the Physics tab and click the Fluid button. Select Domain from the Type menu. Finally, select Gas as the domain type. Select the cylinder and give it the Fluid Physics property. Save the file and then restart the simulation to see the fire and smoke as before. However, nothing happens in some cases. This is due to the fact that the simulation must occasionally be manually reset. The best way to accomplish this is to change the value of the domain's resolution divisions property. This is a straightforward method that we'll employ frequently to force Blender to reset the simulation. The domain object contains the most important options for controlling fluid emission. The first property is the resolution, which we have already seen. It specifies the number of voxels in the domain. Think of a voxel as a 3D pixel. The size of the voxel can be seen in one corner of the cube. As a result, the greater the number of voxels, the greater the final resolution. And, as you might expect, the calculation time. A resolution division of 32 is acceptable for a quick preview. For the final rendering, choose a value between 128 and 256. The following parameter is the time scale. It represents the overall speed of the simulation. Slow motion simulations, for example, can benefit from it. The CLF number parameter is a little trickier to grasp. Simply put, when dealing with fast-moving smoke, increase the minimum and maximum values. As a result, Blender performs more calculations per frame, resulting in a more realistic final result. If you are interested, you can find all of the information in the final course. The Delete an Obstacle option deletes the fluid that is contained within an obstacle. This is useful for avoiding fluid computations when they are not needed. Now we can start modeling the basic scene. Then we'll go over all the other options. Here's the simple city I built. It wasn't made from scratch, but rather with the assistance of a very useful add-on called Blender OSM, which allows you to import real map data, such as terrains, cities, and buildings. Here's a summary of what I did. To begin, you must first download the plugin, which can be found at this link. The plugin can be downloaded for free. After you've configured the plugin, you'll need to choose the location from which you want to extract the map data. Now, enter the coordinates into Blender by copying and pasting them. Then, as the data type to import, select Terrain and click Import. You should be able to see a large area of land. The buildings must now be imported. Change the Import Data option to OpenStreetMap and uncheck the Import Water, Forests, Vegetation, and Roads boxes. You should be able to see all of your city's buildings after a few seconds. Now we must create the foundation for our city. Again, I won't go into too much detail here in order to keep it brief. I'm going to separate the roof from the walls before projecting a real photo of a city onto our mesh. choose the walls, and apply a new material to them. Then, use the city photo as the main texture. This is simple to do with the Node Wrangler add-on. Finally, in the Object Data Property tab, replace any existing UV maps with the new ones. The plan is to create a UV map that will allow us to match our building's walls to the actual walls in the photo. To begin, select the UV Editing tab. By pressing 1 on the numeric keypad, you can set the front orthographic view in the 3D viewport in the UV's panel. Make the city photo the background as well. To select all of the faces, press the Up button. Select Project from View from the UV menu. You should be able to see all of the UV faces that correspond to the walls in the UV panel. You must now move and scale the UVs to match the image below. To see the material, select the Viewport Shading button in the 3D viewport. To achieve a better texture projection, you must, of course, fine-tune the position of the various UV islands. You can also move a single wall to the corresponding building in the image. You can also change the UV projection of the individual buildings. Then, in order to have a beautiful night illumination, we must add a HDR image to the world. We can also add some reflections and emissions to the building materials. Finally, we must design the roof's material. This is much simpler. We can simply assign a basic texture to the object. In this case, in the Texture Coordinate node, select Object and adjust the corresponding scale. When you don't have UVs and need a quick way to apply a texture, use the Object mode. It's now time to decide where we want the asteroid to impact the ground. I chose this location because it was close to this lovely tower. To frame our composition, let's add a camera. I included 2 cameras in the final rendering, one for the top-down view and the other for the first-person shoot. You can put them wherever you want. I also attempted to refine this structure as it is close to the camera and will be visible for the majority of the time. Finally, I inserted 2 images of the sky in the background. You must also make the film transparent. The HDR image will not be visible in the rendering as a result. When you are satisfied with this, we can proceed to the asteroid simulation. The first step is to create the asteroid itself. We can begin by adding a sphere and positioning it where we want the simulation to begin. Set the subdivision count to 3. We now want the sphere to crash to the ground and break into hundreds of pieces. This is exactly what we can do with the rigid body dynamic. So, we can select the sphere and in the Physics tab, activate the Rigid Body button. As default, the body is marked as active. This is fine because the object must be subject to the simulation's forces. When you start the simulation, the ball falls down, as we would expect. We, on the other hand, want the sphere to collide with the ground. As a result, we must also include a portion of the terrain in the simulation. This time, I'm going to make it passive because it only needs to function as a collider and isn't affected by gravity or other forces. Now the ball strikes and lands on the ground. However, I want the asteroid to fall obliquely rather than vertically. Adding an external force, such as wind, is one way to accomplish this. The ball is now moving obliquely, just as we desired. The next step is to figure out how to break the sphere when it hits the floor. The only way to do that is to have a broken ball before dropping it. To do so, select the sphere and then select the Cell Fracture action from the Quick Effects menu. Here, we can specify how we want the object to be broken. Last but not least, give the scene collection a name. As a result, all of the pieces will be placed within that collection. Finally, press OK and the sphere will be fractured into many pieces. While the objects are still selected, go to the Rigid Body menu and select Add Active. In the simulation, all of the pieces become active objects. Remove the original sphere from the simulation at this point. When you play the animation, the ball should fall and break when it hits the ground. However, there is an issue with the simulation. The wind moves the asteroid fragments when they hit the ground. The wind is a fun way to animate these objects, but it isn't appropriate for our needs. It is easier to manually animate the asteroid's position by adding an empty object and linking the other pieces to it. Before you do so, remember to delete the wind force that we created. Select all of the objects in the collection, beginning with the empty. As a result, the empty becomes the active object. Now, hold down Ctrl-P and choose Object and keep Transform. To animate the asteroid, turn on the Animated property in the Rigid Body tab. In this case, the object's motion will be defined solely by the animation's keyframes. To apply the same property to all of the objects, shift-click to select all of the asteroid's pieces. The active object is the first one you select, and it is displayed in a lighter orange color. Now, hold down the Alt key and click on the Animated property. As a result, the same setting is applied to all other objects. The asteroid should now follow the empty object. However, it doesn't hit the ground as, for the time being, the animation is only driven by the keyframes that we created. What we need to do is change the animation type right after the second keyframe. As a result, we must keyframe the animated property, unchecking it in the following frame. In the first part of the animation, the asteroid now follows the empty. And in the second part, it will be subject to the simulation's physics properties. You can now precisely set some properties, such as bouncing and friction, to achieve the desired animation. Objects in these simulations frequently continue to move and rotate for a long time. This is a common problem that can be avoided by using the damping and deactivation properties. Damping is useful for reducing an object's movement and rotation as if there were an opposing force. The deactivation property, on the other hand, literally deactivates an object's dynamics. I also want to highlight the sub-steps per frame property in the Rigid Body World tab. It essentially improves the simulation's accuracy. We have several options for baking the animation. It is generally advised to bake the simulation before rendering or adding more physical effects, such as the fire and smoke we'll see shortly. This improves the simulation stability and eliminates potential glitches. We can now proceed to the simulation of fire and smoke. First and foremost, we must include the domain in the simulation. Then, on the Physics Properties tab, click the Fluid button and select Domain as the type. You should also specify the path to the cache folder, otherwise, Blender will use the cache's default path. Now we must convert all of the asteroid fragments to fluid and change the flow behavior to inflow. The modifier must now be copied to the other fragments. Select this object in the outliner as usual, and then shift-click the last one. As a result, we select all of the objects, and the first one becomes the active one. In order to copy a modifier, we'll use an add-on called Copy Attributes. Check the add-ons menu to see if it was installed. Now, hold down Ctrl and C and select Copy Selected Modifiers, then choose the Fluid modifier. This modifier will be applied to all subsequent objects. However, not all of the modifier's properties were copied. So, while all of the objects are still selected, right-click on the properties we changed earlier and select Copy to Selected. Flow type and flow behavior were the properties. When you start the simulation, the asteroid emits a lot of fire and smoke. Each asteroid fragment is a source of flow. The inflow property indicates that the object continuously emits smoke. On the other hand, geometry implies that we only have the volume of the object. When you have a fast-moving object, the sampling substeps property is useful for improving simulation quality. In this example, increasing the substeps to 20 results in a significant improvement. Remember that, when using a fast-moving emitter, it is preferable to increase the substeps value to achieve a smoother flow. When dealing with smoke and fire, one of the most important factors to consider is the direction and rate at which the smoke and flames move. This has the potential to significantly alter the energy of the simulation. The attribute initial temperature refers to the temperature difference between the smoke and the domain. As a result, the faster the smoke rises, the higher the temperature. We must deal with the initial velocity property if we want to control the exact direction of the smoke. We can use it to direct the emission of smoke and fire. There is also the normal property. This is the velocity along the object's vertex normals. When using the source velocity, Blender adds the velocity of the emitter to the movement of the smoke. And this comes in handy when we have a moving source flow object. At the domain level, we can also change the flow direction and movement. The buoyancy density parameter describes the fluid's tendency to rise or fall. The heat parameter comes next. It is similar to the temperature property that we saw in the flow object. Higher values cause the smoke to rise higher. Another critical parameter to consider is the noise property. It, as the name implies, adds some noise to the flow. However, as we can see in this simulation, this property can also be used to add more details to the smoke and fire flow. Before we begin, keep in mind that there are 3 ways to cache a simulation. The simulation is computed in real time with replay while the play button is pressed. All and modular save the simulation data to the hard drive in the path you specify. The all type indicates that all simulation components, such as smoke, noise, or fluid mesh data, are computed at the same time. The simulation is cached on disk, so you can play it even if you reopen the Blender file. The modular type is the other one. This means that the simulation's components are computed independently. I strongly advise you to use this method. It's also a good idea to check the is resumable property. This allows you to pause and resume the baking process. In the simulation in the middle, I activated the noise parameter and set the strength value to 0. This improves the simulation by adding some details. The uppers factor defines the extra detail. In the final domain, I also increased the noise's strength. This is the simulation we came up until now. When you look at the asteroid, you can see that the smoke and fire are emitted far away from the asteroid's surface. This gap can be closed by lowering the surface emission property. As previously discussed, another useful parameter is the initial velocity. However, I want the smoke to travel in the opposite direction of the asteroid. As a result, I set a negative value. We can now proceed to the domain properties. The first thing we should change is the resolution divisions parameter. It should be at least 128 or higher for the final render. We can also increase the maximum and minimum time steps, for example, to 10 and 6. This helps to improve the simulation's accuracy. I'd also like the smoke trail to be narrower and move up faster. As a result, we can lower the surface emission value to 0.2 and the source initial velocity value to -0.8. It is also advisable to enable the adaptive domain property. As you can see, the domain is now resized in each frame, allowing the simulation to run much faster. Change the cache tab to modular and enable the is resumable property. Then select a cache folder. You can now save the simulation to disk by pressing the Bake Data button. As a final step, we must enable the noise property. As previously stated, this is useful for increasing the fine details. Now you have to bake the data and then the noise separately. It would also be preferable if the smoke dissipated gradually. I'm going to do that by enabling the dissolve property. A value of 50 can be a good choice. However, this can cause the domain to suddenly shrink due to a problem with how Blender computes the adaptive domain. In such cases, simply disable the adaptive domain option. It will take longer to bake, but it should finally solve the problem. The final enhancement we can make is to add some energy and power to the simulation when the asteroid collides with the ground. You can do so by animating the reaction speed, temperature maximum, and temperature minimum properties. As a final step, we must create the smoke and fire material. First, remove the principled shader and replace it with the principled volume shader. The color parameter affects the overall color of the smoke. The density field is useful for multiplying the density of the smoke on a global scale. Below we have the name of the attribute, which is used to compute the density distribution. This density attribute can also be used as an input value for the density itself. As you can see, the shape of the smoke slightly changes. Essentially, we are now multiplying the density by the density itself. We can also add a math node and configure it to perform the power operation. We can also make the smoke emit light by adjusting the emission strength attribute. You can also use any of the smoke attributes to define the emission range. The next parameter, black body intensity, governs the fire's material and color. You can finally see some beautiful fire if you set the value to 1 or any value you want. The temperature attribute governs the color and intensity of the fire. There are numerous ways to change the color and shape of the fire. This is how I went about it. Now we can take a look at the final scene. I also included some particles after the asteroid hits the ground to give more strength and energy to the simulation.